Hello, and welcome to what is going to be a quick overview of United States history between the Gilded Age and the decline of Richard Nixon. This is intended to be a fast review of all the basic terms and concepts in a narrative style so that you can piece them together for large essay questions. I'm going to start by talking about the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is a dramatic period of change for the United States. It's after the end of Reconstruction, and it's a period of incredible economic and technological growth. For the first time, you have mass adoption of industries like the railroad and the telegraph, which had existed previously, but now are used on a much larger scale. What that allows is for individuals that we call either captains of industry or robber barons to dramatically increase the amount of wealth because for the first time in America's history, it is possible to sell goods from coast to coast. Up until the Gilded Age, it was very difficult to sell goods that were produced really outside of 50 miles from where they were made. But during the Gilded Age, we see the American economy get stitched together for the first time. And that allows these really, really powerful individuals, men like J.D. Rockefeller, who you see on the left hand side. He forms Standard Oil and dominates that industry. Other titans like J.P. Morgan, who is a major financier and as well a railroad baron. These gentlemen are able to use a variety of practices to corner the market. The first important term to remember are trusts. What is a trust? A trust is like a monopoly. Essentially, it allows a board to control several different companies at the same time. So let's say you have three different railroads that operate in the South. Railroad A, B, and C. If you take all three of them and you put them into a trust, technically they're separate companies, but now they can set the prices one at a time. And what that allows you to do is basically dictate how things are going to work in a given industry. It eliminates competition and allows you to raise prices. So it's bad for the overall consumer, but at the same time, it's very good for these individuals because they can keep prices high and wages low. The two main policies that were used during the Gilded Age to accomplish all of these goals are what's called horizontal integration, or sometimes expansion, and vertical integration. I'm going to start with vertical integration because it's the easiest. In vertical integration, you own every single step of the process. So let's take oil. You would own the wells that you drill the oil from, you would own the refining process, you would own the trucks that take the oil to its location, and then you would own the gas station. So you, from point A to point D, own every step of the process. So you're not ever competing with anyone else other than your own company. In horizontal expansion, you're using trust to essentially just buy up all your competitors. So instead of having vertical integration and owning every step of the oil production process, you're just going to buy all the refineries. And that way you can set the price for refining the oil at whatever you want to. Now, there was a lot of reaction to this in the Gilded Age because while these individuals became very wealthy and very powerful, at the same time, a lot of people suffered, a lot, particularly low skilled workers. And so that's why during the Gilded Age, you see the formation of labor unions for the first time and worker strikes, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 being the best example. Though, by and large, to be honest with you, the labor unions were unsuccessful. This is also a period of increased nativism in the United States. There's new immigrants coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe for the first time, and the United States starts to set quotas on the number of people that can come to cut down on that labor pool. It's also a period where wealth and the accumulation of wealth is seen as overwhelmingly positive by the population. One of the concepts to be aware of is called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the idea that some people are, quite frankly, just born with the attributes that are going to make them successful. So there's no reason to have Social Security. There's no reason to have welfare systems because if you're not successful, it is sadly your own fault. And there's nothing that society should do to accommodate you in that regard. Now, moving on from that, we step into the Progressive Era where we really start to see a lot of pushback against the Gilded Age. So, the Progressive Era, if you think about it, is a reaction to what happened in the Gilded Age. So, during the Gilded Age, you have a lot of accumulation of wealth by individuals. During the Progressive Era, this is when you start to see the individuals push back on that to a large extent. And there's a number of different things that are passed and laws that become commonplace that are important. First are some of the regulatory ones. There's the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both in 1906. These are passed to try to regulate industries for the first time because the meat that was being produced during the Gilded Age was, to put it mildly, disgusting. All right. And so the government starts to clamp down on that for the first time. One of the most important progressive era presidents is Teddy Roosevelt, who you see with the glasses there on the right hand side of the screen. Teddy Roosevelt is known as the trust buster. His job, using the biggest weapon that we have, which is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is passed by Congress, is his way of trying to break apart some of these large organizations so that competition can be greater, which would improve the situation for your consumers. All right. So you have Teddy Roosevelt, who's your big progressive era president. He's also very involved in conservation for the first time. If you've been to a national park, odds are you went to a park that was established by Teddy Roosevelt. So those are the important things to know about him. But there's a couple of other amendments that are passed during this time period. So an amendment is a change to the United States Constitution. They're very difficult to get through, but we have several of them during the progressive era. The 16th Amendment was passed, which allowed for the first time an income tax to be placed on some of those wealthy individuals. Prior to the passage of the 16th Amendment, the Supreme Court had ruled income tax unconstitutional. The 17th Amendment, likewise, allowed for people to make what we call direct election of senators. So, 17th Amendment, senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, it was up to the states how they selected their senators, and most of the time, they were chosen by the state legislatures. So, you didn't get to vote for either of your two senators. The 17th Amendment changed that. In the 18th Amendment, we passed what is called prohibition, which eliminates the consumption or sale of alcohol in the United States. That's going to be the only amendment that's ever taken back. And then, of course, there's the 19th Amendment, because the progressive era is also the height of the women's suffrage movement. Suffrage is the right to vote, so women seeking the right to vote, and they get it finally with the 19th Amendment. The other progressive era president to be aware of is Woodrow Wilson, who you see on the opposite side. Now, Woodrow Wilson wins the election of 1912 because Teddy Roosevelt runs as a third party against William Howard Taft, who runs as the Republican. Wilson is the Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt and Taft split the vote, and as a consequence, Wilson is able to win. He continues progressive era policies, though I would say in a watered down format. Though mostly he is known for getting America into World War One. Although, to be fair, America is very minorly involved in World War One. Our troops are really only on the ground for a couple of months. So the other things to keep in mind, though, when it comes to World War One, questions usually result around why does the United States get involved in World War One? Well, there's a couple of things that happen that you should be aware of. The first is the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. In 1915, a steamer called the Lusitania, which is a ship, is sunk by German U-boats. Those are sort of beginner submarines off the coast of Ireland. On board with that British ship were actually a number of Americans. Americans get extremely angry about this, and they consider declaring war on Germany. They don't for another 2 years. In 1917, two things happen that force America to enter World War I. The first is we intercept what is called the Zimmermann telegram. It's a telegram from Germany to Mexico, asking Mexico to attack the United States so that the United States would be distracted and would not be able to get involved in World War I on the side of England, France, and Russia against the Central Powers, which at this point was basically Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire being involved to a lesser degree. And then the other big thing that happens is Germany announces that it's going to begin what they call unrestricted submarine warfare again, which means they're going to start to fire on any ships around the British Isles. This upsets America, that does a lot of trade with the British. And of course, we have a lot of cultural connections to Great Britain as well. And so Wilson enters the war on the side of the who are called the Allied powers at that time. Now, the goal in World War I is very lofty. The idea is to make the world safe for democracy, and so on and so forth. So, at the end of the war, which ends pretty quickly after the United States gets involved, Wilson proposes a peace treaty called the 14 Points. And most of these points revolve around the idea of preventing future wars. A key portion of this is the League of Nations. Think of the League of Nations like an early UN. The problem is the United States ultimately rejects the treaty that all of this is the part of. That's called the Treaty of Versailles. Because we reject the Treaty of Versailles, the United States doesn't join the League of Nations, and it's effectively useless from the beginning, which almost guarantees World War II to happen. After the end of World War I, the United States enters a period that's called the Roaring Twenties. Just like in the Gilded Age, there's a huge amount of technological and economic change and growth during this period. The radio becomes very, very popular and widespread for the first time, as does the automobile. And so this is also the era, of course, of prohibition, where there are speakeasies, gangsters, jazz music becomes very popular, women's liberation becomes more popular, women are contributing more in society, they're becoming more employed, they're going out to parties, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of action going on in the 1920s, but there's also a tremendous amount of consumption. And America essentially becomes a consumer based economy. That is, goods that are produced for people to purchase. Now, all of this comes to a close in 1929 when the stock market crashes. Essentially, what happened was the stock market had become wildly overvalued. People were buying stocks on what is called margin, which means you're borrowing against the value of the stock, which is great if the value of that stock goes up. But if the value of that stock goes down, not only did you lose the value of the stock, but now you owe money that you can't pay back. As the stock market crashes, people are able to buy less goods. Remember that consumer economy I talked about. Suddenly, people can't buy as many goods, so manufacturers don't need to make as many goods. So they lay off some of their workforce. As you lay off more people, people can buy less, consumption goes down ever more, and slowly but surely it turns into a death spiral for the American economy. At the same time, there are runs on the bank. So we call these bank runs. People quite literally running to their local banks to try to withdraw their money. Well, why did they do that? The answer is because at this point, banks were not regulated to any large extent. So banks had invested more money than they had in the stock market. When the stock market collapsed, they didn't have the money to give people back the money that they had deposited. And so people quite literally ran to the banks in an effort to get that money back before the banks ran out of money. Simultaneously, at the same time, we have a major ecological disaster going on in the Great Plains. That's called the Dust Bowl. You can see an image of that in the bottom left hand corner of your screen right now. For years, farmers in the states of Kansas, Nebraska, northern Texas, parts of Colorado had overfarmed their land that had leached off the topsoil. And as a result, when a series of droughts hit, the land quite literally blew away. This resulted in massive demographic changes as thousands upon thousands of people had to leave their homes in these states, and the majority of them finding new homes in the state of California. This is when you see California's population really start to go up. In 1932, Americans had had enough of the Republican administration's woefully inept ability to deal with the Great Depression. So they turned to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's going to be our longest serving president. When it's all said and done, he's going to begin 4 terms. No other president has been elected more than 2 times. And there will be a constitutional amendment after FDR preventing anyone from running more than twice. So, what does FDR do? Well, everything that he does is built around restoring the economy. And this is a series of legislative acts that are passed during a Congress that's called the 100 Days or First 100 Days. It doesn't actually refer to the first 100 days of FDR's administration, like from the time he takes office. It refers to a specific time period during which Congress passed a lot of legislation. And this is all called the New Deal. New Deal legislation was based around shoring up the economy. So, what are the important things that the New Deal passes? Well, the first is the Social Security Act, We didn't have Social Security before this. Social Security becomes a national welfare system. Workers contributed to it throughout their period of employment. And then when they retire at a certain age, they receive essentially a fixed sum or pension for the rest of their lives. This is subsidized by the United States government. By the way, it's not self supporting by worker contributions to any degree, but it did a lot to help people down the road. The other thing that he decided to do was regulate those banks for the first time and regulate the exchange of stocks. So we have two things that come into being: FDIC, which is Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So money that you put into banks is going to be backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States. That's to prevent those bank runs from before. And then there's the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission. So we're going to regulate the way that people are trading on the stock market so that there aren't these big boom and bust cycles. That's what we're trying to avoid. The other key component here was, how do we get more of Americans back to work since so many people were unemployed? And honestly, he passed a couple of legislative acts that tried to deal with this. The first was the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps paid young men to work on public parks, to work on large public projects. Again, if you've been to a public park and you've walked in a trail, that trail was probably created by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Its primary goal was to just get money into the economy. It also passed the Tennessee Valley Act, or TVA. The purpose behind that was to put a series of dams in the region. Those dams would not only put people to work in building them, but they would also create hydroelectric power that could be distributed to the South. And that was pretty successful. The least successful act was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. FDR and many realized that farmers had produced too many crops leading up to the Great Depression. And when there's too much of something, the price goes down. So they needed to stabilize prices for things like corn, wheat, cotton, and so on and so forth. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act was basically paying farmers not to farm. Now, this got FDR and his administration into hot water with the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court said that's not constitutional. You can't tell farmers that they can't farm. This led FDR to turn to what is called his court packing plan. His idea was the three justices who always ruled against him in every case happened to be a little bit older. And so he said, well, I should be allowed to appoint three new justices to the Supreme Court and balance them out. Now, to be clear, there is nothing in the Constitution that says that there needs to be nine Supreme Court justices. That's just the number that we've settled on. All the Constitution says is that there shall be a Supreme Court. The public, however, hated that plan, and FDR ultimately never went through with it, though he remained an overwhelmingly popular president. And the other reason, of course, that he's a popular president is because the United States enters World War II at the end of 1941 after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, FDR had been agitating for the Americans to be involved more even before Pearl Harbor. He called the United States the arsenal of democracy, and we had been providing weapons and materials to the Allied powers, mostly Great Britain, until the entrance of the Soviet Union into the war in 1940, at which time we started to provide goods and materials to the Soviet Union as well, so they could fight Nazi Germany. This he upped the notch a little bit with this, with what was called the Lend-Lease Act in 1940. Pursuant to the Lend-Lease Act, he could essentially give the British and give the Soviets war materials in exchange for the promise to pay the Americans back at a later date. He made this equivalency to lending your neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire in their house. And it was successful. And honestly, by and large, it was American industrial capacity more than our military might that won the Second World War. But FDR didn't live to see the end of the war. He dies in the middle of his fourth term and is succeeded by his vice president, Harry Truman, who you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And the first thing that Truman is told at the end of World War II is, welcome, Mr. President, to the Oval Office. By the way, you should be aware we have created a super weapon. That's called the atomic bomb. We didn't tell you about it. This is true. He had no idea. But now you should be aware that you could destroy the world if you want to. So would you like to do it? Truman ultimately decides to use two atomic weapons, one on Hiroshima, one on Nagasaki. The Germans had already surrendered to try to end the war with Japan, which he successfully does in 1945. While there's a lot of military components to America's involvement in the Second World War, those are not usually tests, so I'm not going to go into them. But one thing that you should know is that the Second World War, again, saw a dramatic reorganization of American society. Not only did our industrial capacity win the war, but we came out of the war as the superpower when it came to industrial might in the world. Europe was totally destroyed. Soviet Union couldn't come close to touching what we were able to produce. Women had really gone to work to a large extent during World War II, and they were reluctant to go back to the homes, most of them after the Second World War. So you see more involvement of females in the workforce as a consequence of the Second World War. But the thing that happens immediately after World War II, and you can probably see this coming, is there's a massive falling out between the Soviet Union, and this starts to happen even before the end of the war, and the United States. And so we enter a period that's called the Red Scare and then ultimately the Cold War. Um, the American policy throughout the Cold War is going to be one that we call containment, which is preventing communism from spreading around the globe. Winston Churchill, who's the British Prime Minister, gives a famous speech at the end of the Second World War saying that there is now an iron curtain being drawn across Europe, one side of it being West, free, capitalist, and democracy, the other side being authoritarian, communist, and under the control of the Soviets. This is when NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, comes into place with its famous Article 5 that attack against one is an attack against all. That's an effort to curb Soviet aggression. There's a series of conflicts back and forth between the Americans and the Soviets. We can get into some of them. One of them is the Berlin airlift. Berlin is divided in half, just like Germany is after the Second World War. But the city of Berlin, even though it's divided in half, is actually inside the Soviet section of Germany. And at one point, the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, decides he's just going to blockade it. In an effort to relieve the city, Harry Truman arranges a massive airlift of supplies to relieve West Berliners. And it's the biggest airlift in history, and it's incredibly successful and shows that America is able to do things technologically that, quite frankly, the Soviets can't. And ultimately, Stalin has to back down. Then there's the Korean War. In 1950 to 1953, there's a war back and forth between what are still today the two halves of Korea, the northern communist half and the southern, what is today democratic half, though it wasn't democratic at the time. The United States decides it will intervene, and ultimately, the Northern Koreans, with the assistance of the then Chinese communists, are pushed back to the 38th parallel. That is the border between the two countries today. There is technically no peace treaty. The war is still in an armistice, which means there's just a pause in the fighting. While all this is going on internationally, there's a huge amount going on in the domestic sphere. During the Red Scare, Senator Joseph McCarthy, who's at the bottom left hand of your screen, forms the House Un American Affairs Committee, or HUAC for short. This investigates alleged communists throughout the American government until he turns his attention to the military when he is completely undone and brought down by popular opinion and dies of alcoholism shortly thereafter. At the same time, there are huge changes to American societies that we should talk about in the 1950s. In the 1950s, you have the baby boom. The baby boomers are older now, but you have a huge, tremendous growth in the population that's going to have major consequences throughout the period. You have the growth of television. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is a World War II general, you see him at the bottom left hand side of your screen, is an incredibly successful president. He's a Republican. He forms the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. So if you've driven on the interstate ever, you've driven on a road that was created by Ike or Eisenhower, as we like to call him. Likewise, this is the rise of the suburbs. People are moving out of the inner cities and into the suburbs for the first time. This is driven mostly by changes in the automobile. Consumerism and TV culture is on the rise. And there's the GI Bill, which passes a tremendous amount of money for individuals who served in World War II to go to college. So you have a huge number of Americans going to college for the first time and buying their first homes for the first time as the government starts to subsidize the cost of that. While that's being said, in the 1950s, we also have the beginnings, the real beginnings of the civil rights movement. And in the 1950s, that's really focused on schools and desegregating the schools. There's a series of events that take place to the landmark case, which is Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. In 1954, the Warren Court strikes down in a 9-0 decision the idea of segregated schools, dealing a major blow to the then existing Jim Crow law situation across the American South. However, some people don't want to desegregate the schools, and it had to be done by force. The most famous case of this is the Little Rock Nine, which is 9 African American students who in Little Rock, Arkansas, tried to desegregate one of the big high schools there. The then governor tried to bar their admission into that school, forcing President Eisenhower to intervene. He sent the National Guard in, and the school was desegregated. The turbulent 1960s continued much of this. In the 1960s, we have Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous March on Washington. This is the I Have a Dream speech moment. That's in 1963. And a lot of this culminates under President Johnson, who's actually on the left, who signs into law the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Many of those protections are still in place today and form the bulwark that we have that prevents minority rights from being eroded in the United States. That's really the end of the Jim Crow South, 1964 and 1965. While a lot of the court cases get a lot of the attention, it's those two acts that bring down the end of segregation. Now, while all this is going on, there's a tremendous amount of other protests. This is the rise of counterculture. You have Woodstock, a huge music festival that takes place. All of those baby boomers who were born in the late 1940s, they're in their teens and early 20s at this point. So you have this huge young population that's really excited about the future and is highly optimistic. That starts to come to an end, however, under Johnson and Nixon in Vietnam. So the Vietnam War and our involvement really starts under Kennedy, but ramps up a lot in 1964. The Vietnam War has been called America's unwinnable war. Our decision to try to support South Vietnam against the communist North was grounded in the idea that's called domino theory. In domino theory, if one state becomes communist, then the state next to it is likely to become communist, and so on and so forth, like dominoes that fall down. And so the United States intervened in a conflict that they really never had any chance of winning, in an effort to try to prevent the flow of communism. And there's a lot of reasons that we didn't have much of a chance to win in Vietnam, but there's a huge domestic backlash to the Vietnam War. American universities are swept up in anti war hysteria. There's protests everywhere. There's counter protests by pro war individuals. These are called hawks. The peace protesters are called doves. And these two sides tend to get into conflicts. In 1970, there's a shooting at Kent State University when National Guardsmen open fire and kill 4 students in the middle of a protest. That actually leads to even more backlash and the rise of the conformist president, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon runs on a law and order platform and is very supportive of continuing the war in Vietnam, despite the fact that the Pentagon Papers come out showing that most of our top brass didn't believe that we could win the war, as we were telling Americans that we still could. Unfortunately for Richard Nixon, he winds up getting swept away by his own controversy. In 1974, Richard Nixon becomes the only president to resign from the presidency. And he does that as a result of the Watergate scandal. To put it mildly, Nixon was caught with his hand in the cookie jar, recording his then opponents for the 1972 presidential race, a race that, by the way, he was essentially guaranteed to win. So, this is your ultimate unforced error. There was no reason for him to do any of that taping. He bungles it. It's bungled by the Republican Party. He gets caught doing it. He tries to back out. There's no way. And as it looks like he's certain to be impeached and removed from office, Nixon resigns. And that ends today's brief overview of, about 100 years of American history. I would say if there's an overall theme in this period, it is, what does it mean to be an American? America changes its identity so much over this 100 years, becoming much more pluralistic, much more inclusive, and that's the important takeaway from the total.